Thank you, Tim. I would first like to thank His Excellency Bishop Alphonsus for hosting us and for being here. He honors us with his presence. Thank the organizers for inviting me, and thank you for being here with us. The historical unity between Ireland and America in common cause goes back to the independence of the United States. Not far from where I live in Virginia, the Irish Brigade fought valiantly side by side with the American troops for its independence at the famous Battle of Fredericksburg in 1862. So heroic was the effort of the Irish that it would prompt some English observers to state that America had been lost through the Irish. Americans and the world have a great debt of gratitude to Ireland. I don't need to tell you about the preservation of civilization, culture, and history, and the faith that Ireland carried out for 1,500 years. It's this historical effort, I believe, that distinguished you amongst the nations of the world. I see Ireland as the conscience of the West, and this is why this is important. Not that you will be famous for the Celtic tiger, perhaps. It's your 1,500 years of sustained effort and a civilizational force in the world that really matter. And it is one that many elites around Ireland are asking you to throw away without really considering what we are discussing. It seems to me a fact that today the historical and national consensus of most European nations is being systematically and intentionally erased from the cultural memory of its populations. So it is therefore important to reflect on what was that consensus. What were those foundations that built the institutions, and I believe are embedded in your Constitution? I think the Irish Constitution is one of the best constitutions crafted, and one of the best in the world, really. I think it's crafted in a much more philosophically sound manner than the American Constitution. It would be perhaps useful to begin by recalling that a constitution's aim principally is to reach and make justice permanent, to allow justice to flourish. No legislation, no law, no amendments in the Constitution can seek ends outside of justice. The inverse is quite obvious. You cannot legislate injustice, you cannot enshrine injustice into a constitution and hope that that is a true reflection of law. The preamble of your Constitution, which is like a little small treatise of political philosophy, gives a vision of what Ireland is all about. And the rights that come and the articles that follow in the Constitution delineate that original vision in the preamble. The question that we're addressing is really a grave question, and I think Lila will really speak to the damage that abortion has done in the United States since 1973. I argue that the introduction, the legalization of abortion is like a virus at the heart of the Constitution. And it is what is consuming, I believe, many of the democracies around the West. You cannot have a true democracy after you have legalized abortion. And I will try to explain why. I also think that abortion is a symptom of a bigger problem. And this problem, in my view, is the philosophical collapse of the West and the collapse today of a proper notion of democracy. I will have to shorthand some of my thoughts on this matter, but it's something to maybe consider and think about. After the Second World War, democracy took what I call a paradigm shift from what was a substantial philosophical understanding of fundamental rights and democracy to what is now known as procedural democracy, or political liberalism, as John Rawls called it. The essential difference between the two, and this explains, I think, partly why we're reaching such conclusions, why you can have arbitrary assemblies, as John was delineating, offer recommendations on removing fundamental rights. After World War II and the tragedies of the totalitarian regimes in Germany and Russia and other places, over 100 million victims just by communism, the philosophical world, particularly in France, was completely disenchanted with the notion of truth. The great philosophical systems that they had built through Hegelianism and other things, Marxism, turned out to be a real tragedy. It was this sort of despair of the possibility of truth, the possibility of universal conclusions, foundational principles that they abandoned. The big distinction between modern thought and postmodern thought is that postmodern thought no longer believes in the capacity of reason to achieve truth. This translated into the political order, into democracies that could not, antecedent to the procedure, to the vote in a democratic society, determine the truth of anything. So procedural democracy does not believe that there are antecedent principles, objective truths, before the procedure. It is known as procedural democracy because the truth of the matter depends on the result of the procedure, and it could be therefore anything. Rolling towards X, Nietzsche used to say, a variable that could be filled by anything. What does this mean concretely? It means that people who believe in a procedural democracy believe that you can vote on anything. And the result could be today abortion, tomorrow it could be something different. That the thing that matters is the procedure, that there be a fair election. There is never a question on what you have jurisdiction over, what you can actually vote for in a democracy. And I would like to make this my first point. I hope you realize that it is not within your purview, within your power, to have a referendum on life in Ireland. That this is not only immoral, illicit, and argue unconstitutional. You don't have within your democratic power the jurisdiction to decide who lives and who dies in Ireland. You can't vote on that, right? We could not take a vote in this room and decide who lives and who dies. No institution, no government, no court can pass a law or an amendment and give you the power to decide who lives and who dies. So I hope you can see that this is far from being a democratic procedure. They're claiming in the media that this assembly that John was discussing is part of the democratic procedure, the democratic process, the voice of Ireland. They represent you. But it is completely anti-democratic that citizens of Ireland think that they can vote people, a group of people, in this case the unborn, out of existence by passing laws that remove protections on their most fundamental right, the right to life. Do you follow that? Okay. So it's good to know that this is an illicit referendum. From a philosophical, political, philosophical point of view, this is completely illicit and I argue unconstitutional. It is true that you may have to vote still in the referendum because they have abandoned reason. But I think it's very important, and I argued yesterday in Sligo that the church, even though it will call their followers to vote in the referendum to protect the amendment, should say very clearly that they consider this to be an anti-democratic process for the reason I just mentioned. We do not have the right to vote up and down on who lives and who dies in a democracy, in any regime. A more poignant example would be, if you really think that you have the power to vote on who lives and who dies, that means you have the power to do so over any group in our society. Therefore, it would be non-objectionable to have a referendum on the extinction or removing the right that protects the life of other groups. I gave an example yesterday that the Roma, or travelers as you call them in Ireland, could you have a referendum on removing the right to life from the Roma? Since you can amend the Constitution apparently at will, this is what the Assembly and the government is telling you, could you not have a referendum on that? Could the government call a licit referendum in order to abolish private property in Ireland? Let's say that you all decided that private property was an evil. This has happened even in the 20th century. Would that be a legal, licit, constitutional referendum? You don't have the power to vote away the private property of another person. Your own constitution states the right to private property and external goods to be unalienable right, antecedent to positive law. So not all things in a democracy are under the possibility of a vote or your judgment. Bishop Alphonsus and John were making this point. You cannot vote away fundamental rights. They are called unalienable because they cannot be alienated from the person. This is not a question of positive law. This is a question of the jurisdiction does not exist for any institution, court, or individual, or group to vote away a fundamental right. You can never have an amendment in a constitution that removes a fundamental right and call it legal. There is no such thing as a law that removes fundamental rights. John was mentioning this point. You introduced an amendment to protect and make more explicit a fundamental right that was already there, the right to life of the unborn. This you can do. You can add amendments to make more specific the fundamental rights of a constitution, but you can never remove a fundamental right without committing injustice, of course. The United States Constitution for some time did not consider black people persons, full persons, only 3/5 of a person for taxation purposes. This is an aberration. But think of what it took to remove that. Because the problem in slavery in the United States led to a civil war. Once you go down this path, it is extremely difficult to return to normality. So you should be aware of what the government is asking you to even consider. This is not a question that is under your purview to consider and vote on. Are you with me? Okay. There are further problems. Has anybody in this room read the Constitution, the Irish Constitution, from beginning to end? Okay. I really urge you to read the Constitution. You will immediately see that one of the things that you hear all the time, and seems to me the progressive liberal media in your country and other elites who are attempting to vanquish any thought of religion or even the voice of the church, they probably have not read your Constitution, because your Constitution is full of religious, even invocations, I would say, constantly appealing to God. It says that you have the right to govern yourselves under God. Your preamble starts with an invocation to the Holy Trinity, Most Holy Trinity, and a reminder of the history and tradition and the debts owed to God. Article 44, which you should send to the Irish media, maybe the Irish Times. It seems to me they did not get the memo. The state acknowledges that the homage of public worship is due to Almighty God. Article 44. It shall hold his name in reverence and shall respect and honor religion. It looks like the press definitely has not read this article, right? There's another article in your Constitution which I think is very important. 15.6, Section 1. The right to raise and maintain the military or armed forces is vested exclusively, this is really important, exclusively in the Oireachtas. That is to say that you have in your Constitution agreed that the use of lethal power, lethal force, is vested only in a state institution, right? Why is this important? Governments around the world are allowed licitly to use, within certain limits, lethal force. For instance, to defend a country from an invasion. For instance, to liberate somebody from a terrorist attack or a hostage situation, right? The police and the military can use lethal force. No one complains about that, correct? It can even use it to punish people for terrible crimes, such as capital punishment, which exists in certain countries, certain states in the United States, forbidden by your Constitution. But it is a power that is only exclusive to the state. You cannot, let's say somebody committed a crime, have a trial and a jury of your own making and decide that somebody deserves to be put to death. Right? You will go to jail for murder, right? Even if the person would be guilty, even if the judgment would be the same thing that a court would actually find, you don't have the power of exercising lethal force under ordinary circumstances. It is not vested within you to do so. Exclusively to the state. And I argue that this is unconstitutional, what they are trying to do with the Eighth Amendment, for the following reason. They are giving a franchise of lethal power to private associations, institutions, hospitals, individuals, to kill indiscriminately, that is to say, to use lethal force against other citizens or other human beings indiscriminately. This is illegal for all of you, and it should be illegal for them as well. The state does not have a constitutional right to give you a franchise of lethal power. Think about the problem in the United States when somebody opens up an abortion clinic, of which we have many in the United States, unfortunately. They require from the government, almost as a business requirement, that the government give them a franchise of lethal power, that is to say, permission to kill indiscriminately other human beings. Right? You can't operate an abortion clinic unless you have permission to kill and not be punished. The government has no right, constitutionally speaking, let alone morally speaking, to give anybody else the right to kill other citizens or other human beings. Do you see that? I think lawyers, constitutional lawyers in Ireland, should really think about all the different articles by which their intent to do away with the amendment, the Eighth Amendment, is unconstitutional. When you remove a fundamental right, it's going to contradict many other articles in the Constitution, because the Constitution was built to protect fundamental rights. It is not possible to remove the fundamental right without affecting other articles that they must abide by. And this is one. Nowhere does it say that the government can give other people the right to kill indiscriminately. If that's so, why should other citizens like yourselves why should you not also get the right to kill? A franchise of lethal power. They should include maybe a new amendment, the 31st Amendment, just to make things very clear. And that amendment would read something like, the state holds the right to distribute the ability or the facility for individuals, associations, and private groups to indiscriminately use lethal force. Now we know what we're talking about. Then point 1 and point 2 would be the first group that they select are parents who can use lethal force to terminate the life of their children. Okay, that's one group. Potentially they could have another group, and they do. Doctors who choose to get paid to terminate the life of the unborn also get a franchise of lethal power. They can also kill and not be punished. Does this make any sense to you? If they made that explicit in the Constitution, which would be an honest amendment, now you know that you have an illegitimate government. This is how grave this is. Abortion comes into a democratic system, into a constitution, and it starts delegitimizing the government. It starts eroding constitutional powers. Judicial powers that would sanction this would also be eroded. If you read your constitution carefully, you will see also that it says the Oireachtas shall not enact any law which is in any respect repugnant to this constitution, which this would be, or any provision thereof. Every law enacted by the Oireachtas which is in any respect repugnant to this constitution or to any provision thereof shall, but to the extent only of such repugnancy, be invalid. Even if they would repeal the amendment, even if they would pass a law to have abortion on demand, it would be an invalid law. As Martin Luther King wrote from a jail in Birmingham, an unjust law is no law at all. 3 essential things are required to have a true law. They will fulfill only one if they repeal the 8th Amendment, and that's the 3rd. Promulgation. A law must be promulgated in order to be law. But the first 2 they will never be able to fulfill. The first essential element of authentic law is that there be proper authority. The state, or you, in a referendum, are not the proper authority to remove a fundamental right, because that is de facto impossible. There is no proper authority to remove a fundamental right. No one has that authority. The second essential element to have true law is that it be for the common good. This also they will never be able to fulfill. This is a semblance of the law. St. Thomas used to call it the corruption of the law. It is not a law. 3. If I decided to destroy this microphone because I don't like the way it's producing sound, the Theatre Royal probably would sue me or be pretty upset that I would do so. Can we agree on that?
Yeah.
Why would that be the case? Right. I don't own it. But if it were mine, could I destroy it? Correct. You have a prohibition against owning other human beings in your constitution. That is a prohibition against slavery. Think about the problem. If a father and a mother and an abortionist, not a doctor, I don't call them doctors, abortionists, destroy the unborn in the womb, that presupposes that they own that person. The way that I could destroy this microphone because it is mine. But you don't own your children, because no human being can be owned by another human being. The prohibition against slavery in our Constitution militates against the idea of removing the 8th Amendment. It presupposes, for those who want to repeal the Eighth Amendment, that children are owned in the sense of property by their parents and therefore can be destroyed at will. In order to destroy them, they must give them a franchise of lethal power to do so and not go to jail. So you see, this is corroding and destroying all kinds of articles in your Constitution. This is not just about the Eighth Amendment at all. Nothing will make sense in your Constitution if you allow the most fundamental right to be removed from it. You have a right to private property, but of what use is the right to private property if you are not allowed to live to the age where you can own your first pair of tennis shoes? Of what use is the right to free speech if you're killed before you can utter the first words? Your government can't even propose this referendum and give a rational legal justification for the proposal. I continue. When you lose cultural freedom, which losing the Eighth Amendment clearly would be, you're also losing two of the other freedoms that always go together in a democracy. In every democracy, each one of us establishes three types of relationships: economic, cultural, and political relations. Each one of those relations yields a specific freedom: economic freedom, political freedom, and cultural freedom. They're interlocked in a democracy, and they go up and down together. If you lose cultural freedom, you will be losing political freedom. Repealing the Eighth will be an extreme form of loss of cultural freedom. But you're losing tremendous political freedom, because now unalienable rights, which are rights that cannot be taken away by anybody, you have conceded that the government can take away an unalienable right. You've conceded tremendous amount of political power to the state. Basically, it has unlimited power if it can really remove the right to protect life and to give somebody else the right to kill human beings. You've lost so much political freedom. Do you see that? Of what use are other rights, secondary rights, civil rights, if you've given up on unalienable rights? But you will also lose economic freedom. I maybe will talk a little bit about that problem, but think about this. There is a moral right for the government to ask you to contribute to the common good. We call it taxes. It should be proportional to some measure of what somebody is receiving, but that's another discussion. But if, as it occurs in the United States, if the government starts spending your money that it collects in taxes to subsidize the killing of the unborn, to subsidize institutions and hospitals that kill the unborn, to force insurance companies and employers to pay for women and men to put to death their own children, do they still preserve the moral right to ask for my money in taxes? And I say no. When you pay taxes, you are cooperating to the development of the common good, but you are not giving money that could be used to murder the innocent. This all starts creating a really big problem if you think about it. Right now you're in a moral position that they will campaign to repeal the Eighth Amendment in order to kill the unborn with the money that you've provided to the government, because the government has no money. All the money the government has is from your taxes. Governments don't produce money. So they will use this to promote propaganda to remove the protections for the unborn in order to systematically institutionalize indiscriminate killing to those that they decided to assign a franchise of lethal power. And you're paying for it. In the United States, the government subsidizes the abortion industry to the tune of billions of dollars. It will corrupt your sciences, and this is already happening in Ireland, of course. You have mad psychologists claiming that the solution for women who feel suicidal is to give them an abortion. You hardly need to argue this point. I mean, this is really mad. Abortion has been passed in many countries, but this one was the most extreme excuse I ever found. That a person that is suicidal should get an abortion has to be like the worst psychological or psychiatric prescription I have ever heard of. It's dangerous. The last thing you want to do when you're suicidal is be making life-altering decisions. It is corrupting your sciences. Doctors lying. Publicly lying about the nature of the child. Doctors that would get paid to kill are no longer doctors. Right? Substantially, this is not an accidental change in their profession. This is a substantial change. They have gone from being doctors who are there to restore health to people who kill the unborn under the guise of being doctors. It's like paying a hitman to take care of your child and put him down. Your constitution forbids capital punishment, but I'm sure when Lila talks about the procedure in abortion, you will see that the only individual, the only human beings that will have capital punishment in Ireland, even though it's contrary to your constitution, are the unborn. Because an abortion and repealing the Eighth Amendment is sure sentence of death for tens of thousands of babies in Ireland after that happens. In late-term abortions, they're actually injected with a lethal injection. The same liberal progressives who oppose capital punishment would have that kind of procedure be executed upon an unborn child. And your constitution prohibits capital punishment. I hear often in the radio when somebody is being interviewed on this topic, the accusation that people come to the conclusion that this is completely irrational because they are Catholic. You're a Catholic and therefore you think abortion is some extraordinary evil. I would like to tell you that the fact that the Catholic Church is right about moral issues all the time has not to do with anything except that it is the true church. But you do not need Catholic faith to see what I am telling you. And I'll give you a biblical example just to sort of rub it in a little bit more. When Pontius Pilate washed his hands, psychologically, he didn't really morally wash his hands from the injustice and the murder of Christ, and he asked the people to do the deed. You decide who should die, the innocent or Barabbas. Remember? We relive that every Good Friday, right? You do the deed. You vote on who will live and who will die. This is the same exact thing that they're asking you now. You decide if the unborn child will live or die in Ireland from here on after. Why should you stain your hands with the blood and be complicit in this? But notice the problem. The people that were standing below, deciding who should live and who should die, knew that Christ was innocent, and they knew Barabbas was not innocent, right? They weren't Catholics standing there that day, right? The recognition of injustice, of the murder of the innocent, does not require for you to be Catholic. Right? The people who recognized the injustice that day were not Catholic. The fact that the church happens to be right because it has right reason and divine revelation is not surprising. but it's not because you're Catholic. Injustice was condemned in the earliest constitutions in Athens. At the cradle of democracy, if a ruler would seek to impose an unjust law, he could be indicted, which would be a great thing to introduce in the Constitution. We could indict quite a few unfit rulers in Ireland. Dissident Sophie Scholl, who fought in Germany for the liberation of her people and to awaken the German nation, in 7 famous pamphlets in her group, which was known as the White Rose, she was eventually decapitated by the Nazis. She was a student at Munich University. She was only 21. Her brother, and a few friends. Part of what she wrote should really ring true today. Nothing is so unworthy of a civilized nation as allowing itself to be governed without opposition by an irresponsible clique that has yielded to base instinct. This is what we have today. What are we to do? First and foremost, identify clearly what we are discussing. Identify clearly the problem. And I will just do this small experiment. Under which commandment would abortion be outlawed by? Right, and what is the 5th? Right. Abortion is under the 5th, which is really murder, right? Because you can kill someone and not have committed any immoral act, right? A soldier could shoot an enemy in the field. You could shoot somebody in self-defense. The kill of the 5th Amendment, which is what abortion is the direct killing of an innocent person. So, abortion is a species of murder. You don't have to define who the murderer is, but a murder has occurred, clearly, right? The child didn't die on his own. It is a species, a kind of murder. Why do you oppose abortion? Because you oppose all kinds of murders. As I said yesterday, I opposed the murder of the old person in the apartment when the burglars come in and they kill her. I am against that. I am against a drug dealer who kills teenagers on the street. I am against that. Abortion is simply a kind of murder. It would be inconceivable to take seriously a proposal to institutionalize in your constitution murder, the ability to murder. Let's have an amendment that allows murder. The second thing is a little bit of courage. It seems to me that the press in Ireland is intimidating the Irish faithful, and perhaps even a little bit the church. I don't know. I'm not here often enough to know, but perhaps. I was ordained for the Diocese of Moscow, and I went to the Soviet Union when the wall came down, and largely for the same reason that I come to Ireland. I felt at the time that we had a debt, a moral debt, to go help people who had lived 70 years under communism. The whole West was praying for the wall to come down. And so when it did come down, I went and volunteered and belonged to the Archdiocese of Moscow, and I was ordained in Russia. It is very important. People pray a lot, but there's a big distinction between prayer and action. If God gives you the grace, you are responsible to act. And I believe that Ireland, you are responsible now for the survival of your constitution and your country. You will never have the same country if you allow abortion on demand to come. through fortunes of life, I've been very close to many of the people who are in the German resistance as well, particularly the Stauffenberg family. Klaus Stauffenberg, of course, was the person who attempted on Hitler's life in 1944. I've actually spoken to his son, Berthold, on many occasions. And some of the Stauffenbergs sat on some of the boards of the foundations that I ran. But in talking to members of the resistance, and there were others, the question that always came generations after to the grandparents and the parents from their children was, what were you doing during the war? What were you doing when the final solution began to be put in March? What were you doing on Kristallnacht in Germany? This question will be asked of you. What were you doing when abortion on demand was coming to Ireland? It is not possible to continue to just go to work and lead your normal lives as if nothing was happening. You can win this referendum. If your priests and your bishops carried the faithful in their pews, you would win this referendum. If you don't think this is the most important issue perhaps of your lifetime, it's very rare that you're in a life and death struggle at any time in history. I was not really able to do anything about Roe v. Wade when it came to the United States in 1973. I was too young. But there's a little bit of defeatism in Ireland, I think. You can sort of feel it in the air at times. And you really must shake this off. I can tell you that having been in Russia, I saw bishops who went to prison for 25 years, sent to Siberia for the defense of the faith. Cardinal Slippy was arrested and spent about 25 years in prison, hard labor, in the coal mines of Kamchatka. Bishop Swiatek, Cardinal Swiatek, I knew him personally. He was in prison camp for 12 years. In Siberia, minus 40-degree weather, absolutely would not renounce his faith. Tens of thousands of Catholics and Orthodox, monks and religious were murdered in Russia or sent to prison camps throughout the revolution. Parishioners, Catholic parishioners, when you read the records of what happened in Russia, I mean, when we arrived in Russia, there were no religious orders, there was no seminary, there were 2 bishops, one in Siberia and my bishop in Moscow, and we were covering 11 time zones. No parishes, no pastoral programs to collect money. There was absolutely nothing. We were looking for Catholics that were still alive. We didn't know who was there. This was like the Acts of the Apostles, not very long ago, 1991. John Paul II appointed 2 bishops in 1991 to Russia. Our last bishop was sent to prison camp in 1927, and Russia never saw a Catholic bishop from 1927 until 1991. Two lessons that I would just share with the Irish Church. We never took a penny from the state. We rebuilt cathedrals, schools, seminary, diocesan offices, all our institutions, religious orders, translated books, paid salaries of all the missionaries that were there. We never took a penny from the state. Why? If you lose economic freedom, you are bound to lose moral freedom. It is very difficult to preach against the people who are bankrolling you. You have to preserve economic freedom. The church has to remain independent from the state, especially at this time when the state is so secular and moving completely in the wrong direction. Suffice to go to the Church of Austria or in Germany to see what the church tax is doing to the life of the church. Right? If you don't pay your tax, they don't give you the sacraments. They won't baptize your children. They probably won't give you a funeral. This is a government that comes and collects the tax, but it's a concordant with the church. Universities that take so many subsidies from the state then have to allow things that they would never allow within their code of ethics because they can't have discrimination, quote unquote. So you have abortion groups, you have radical groups of all sorts on Catholic campuses because you're taking money. We never took a penny, and we had absolutely nothing. When my bishop arrived in 1991, he was sharing an apartment with a journalist because the Vatican doesn't send you to Moscow with $1 million in your bag. They just send you. You have to cease to be afraid of the press. This is not real persecution. What you're experiencing in Ireland is nothing. I live with priests who were in prison camp for 38 years in Albania. The paper tiger journalists of the Irish Times cannot possibly scare the Irish people. I will close with this. Well, today I was in the beautiful cathedral here, and there was a relic of Oliver Plunkett. Remember Oliver Plunkett? Most of Ireland probably doesn't remember so well anymore, right? I don't know. But Margaret Clither is somebody that I would like to bring to your attention. Maybe you can think about this. She was, at the time of the persecution of Catholics in England, protecting priests. And for this, she was found guilty and punished. And at the time that she was in prison, she was pregnant. She had 3 children. She was pregnant with her 4th. And she was sentenced to death, and she was... The method they used was they crushed her with huge stones and put a stone in her back, and that would break her back. And this is how she was killed. She was pregnant. It's kind of iconographic for what we're living today. Even Elizabeth I was appalled at what had happened when she learned of this event. The standard by which we should live our lives are not necessarily the people with whom we live. I want to be really clear, with due exception to the great bishop that you have in this diocese. Bishops are sovereign in their diocese. Of course, the Pope has immediate authority over everybody. But they are not subjects to episcopal conferences. Each bishop, each priest, must ensure that their diocese vote to protect life in the womb. This is their job.